Alrighty, I think this is on. All right, before we get going, I just want to thank everyone that was involved in this entire event, and you'll hear in a couple minutes why an event like this is so important to me and a huge part of my life today. So first off is the event staff that are here today that put this entire thing together in a matter of, seemed like a matter of minutes. I was here yesterday and none of this was set up, and it's incredible today. Also a little bit of a shout out to the people that are listening online. I know there's quite a few people listening online as well, so thank you for that. And then our guests today. So first, Carol De Matteo from McMaster, Christine Dalton from the University of Waterloo, Dr. Margot Mountjoy from HPC and the University of Guelph, and Brett Lyons from HPC and Aramosa Physiotherapy. So they're going to be the ones that you're going to get all the important information out of today. I'm just here to get it out of them the best I can. So my background is hockey, sport. That's where I came into my first encounter with concussion and head injury. And it was back in 2009, so I knew nothing about concussion, and it seemed like it wasn't important. It was a bump on the head. Are you feeling okay? You're still awake. You can still go back in and play. That's what concussion was like when I first got to meet it for the first time. So why are we all here today? And the first reason is because every day 3,500 people sustain a concussion in North America. And the next reason, there we go, $10 billion a year are put into care for concussion every year in North America. So those are the negative things. On a little bit more of the positive side is the movement with, it'd be great if I could see what slide is up there. It's amazing that the change in conversation with concussion is happening at an incredible pace today. And one of the most important things in my life, and something I relate to my story, is there's no more dark room. The days of being in the dark room, now reinforced by research, are saying that here are some tools you can use. You don't have to stay in the dark room anymore and wait for those symptoms to subside. And that's one of the main things I'm going to make sure we talk about today. Also, politically, there's change. And this came from an unfortunate event of a young girl that lost her life. But now on a political level, we're seeing change. We're seeing focus put into concussion and head injury in sport, but not only sport. Sport seems to be the hot topic because that's where we see them on TV. That's where we see them in football. But concussion everywhere, there's now more focus, and it's at a political level where change is being enforced instead of just letting individuals make their mind up. If, yeah, I think I have a concussion, I'm going to deal with it. Now it's actually being enforced that, hey, something might be wrong, let's deal with it the right way. And now there's a process enforced to do so. So my story starts when I was about 10 years old. And I guess this is where the issue in my story begins. It's when I found this identity, the only identity I ever thought I would have, which was to play in the NHL. And that's the only thing I could do, that's the only thing I would do. And then when I'm 16 years old, I'm lucky enough to be drafted to the Kitchener Rangers. So at this point, to put yourself in my shoes, I grew up thinking I was going to play in the NHL. I turned 16, I get drafted to the Kitchener Rangers, and now everyone around me in my life is telling me I'm going to have a chance to play in the NHL. So 16-year-old me, the only voice of reason was my mother, that there were other things in life and you may not make it. I wasn't listening to her. So my head was about this big. I was very confident in myself. I was listening to all the people around me telling me I was going to make it. And then telling the story from my point of view, because I only remember, or I forget about a week and the day before it happened. So the story from my point of view is I finished playing a game in Brampton, Ontario. Wasn't injured, no issues. After the game, I got on the bus, I sat down in my seat, and then I woke up in the hospital. And when I woke up in the hospital, I remember my mom was sitting to my left and the doctor was standing to my right. And the doctor, actually before the doctor spoke up, my mom said to me, "Ben, do you know why you're here?" And instantly I started to tear up, because I had no idea how I'd gotten there, where I was, what had happened. I was shaking my limbs, trying to figure out what did I break this time, how are my wrists, Where are the scars? Where are the cuts? Where are the stitches? And I didn't have any of that. So it was probably the scariest moment of my life. And then before my mom could tell me what had happened, the doctor spoke up and said, after that game in Brampton, a whole 24 hours I don't remember, he said the following night you were playing in Kitchener and you were hit behind your net and your head hit the metal stanchion that holds the glass in place. My helmet cracked and fell off. I fell to the ice and was taken in a helicopter to Hamilton General where they could care for me. That wasn't really the scariest things he had to say at that point. He said that sports were out of the question for the rest of my life. I would need a teaching assistant in all my classes if I did return to school. And then he said I may be a different person than I was the first 16 years of my life. And he concluded with saying that my brain was bleeding in 3 different places and that I'd have to stay at the hospital for the next 7 days to see if I would need brain surgery. At that point, sport really, that was probably the only point in my life that sport didn't matter. It was close to life and death. And I remember 2 points in the hospital, and that first one I just explained. The second one was when I got the chance to leave the hospital. The doctor came in and said, we're going to do one more MRI, and if things have cleared up, you can head home here today. If things haven't cleared up, we're going to have to do brain surgery. And the doctor left the room, and a team of nurses came in and took their spot and started gluing beads on my head to map out where they were going to do the surgery. At that point, my mom came over and she was sitting with me. We were trying to stay as positive as we could. And then finally, what felt like 2-3 hours, the doctor came back in and said, Ben, we're not able to explain how you've healed the way you have, but you're going to be able to head home here today. And part of the story I sometimes leave out, I kind of laugh about it. My dad, a firefighter of 25 years, never liked seeing me hurt. So when I ever needed stitches, broke my wrist, he would drop me off at the hospital and call my mom and say, Sue, you got to come deal with this because I don't want to see Ben hurt. And not a word of a lie. So we get the good news. I didn't even think of this at the time. My dad wasn't anywhere. I didn't see my dad in the hospital, really. They put me in a wheelchair, wheeled me downstairs for me to go home, and my dad had actually gone down and started the car and pulled it up front so that when we got the good news, the van would be warm and I could hop in and head home. And I think he's a big source of my optimism and a reason I'm here today. But I was able to head home and continue my recovery. So getting into what we want to talk about today, I leave that hospital. I have this head injury. I'm an athlete. And so then often we turn to being upset and blaming things. So first we think it's the rules. We have to change the rules. We think it's someone else's fault, this head injury conversation, it's someone else's fault, someone else has to help us. So first we go to the rules. The rules in sport need to change. We know that's going to be a slow process, so that's not what we can focus on if we want to get better. If we want to empower ourselves to recover from a head injury, we can't rely on blaming it on other people and saying it's the rules. We have to change the rules. The other concept that really frustrates me is equipment. We then think these little plastic neck braces that they tested on animals are going to protect us in a game of hockey where we're skating at 40 kilometers an hour. No different than the impact and speed in football or concussion, soccer, etc. So then we want to focus on equipment and think equipment's going to save the day. Then we move to fear-mongering. We see articles all the time in the news thinking that if we just scare people away from sport, they'll sit in that dark room long enough that it'll scare them, their symptoms will finally subside after months and months of agony, and will scare them so they never go back to sport. And we know that doesn't work, and that's not going to empower recovery. And I usually don't put the dash through the research when I'm standing in front of people that do the research. I shouldn't be doing that. The only reason I have that dash through the research is because the only issue with it is that sometimes, or I would say often, it's not shared with a group of people. Sometimes it stays in the lab, or it stays in scientific terms that we don't understand. So it takes people like yourselves to come out and hear what this research means, and let's break it down so we can understand it and share it with each other. And that's how we empower recovery, not these other topics here. So you may think my recovery looked like this, because it sounded pretty dark. I was told I was never going to play sports again. But to be honest, my recovery looked like this. And being from Kitchener and having a rivalry with the Guelph Storm. I would say the community in Kitchener was next to none, but for the only time I'll ever say it, is that I'm sure the Guelph Storm community would have done the same thing for an athlete that was in my shoes. And that's all it took. People ask me, what did you do to recover? What did you do? People that have been struggling, they say, what did you do? And the most honest answer I could ever give is that I went online, and this isn't usually recommended. I went on Google and I searched in 2009, when they didn't have symposiums like this. I searched what helps the brain heal, what forces the brain to heal. So I was up to my omegas, I was doing balance drills, I was doing Sudokus all day, I was napping whenever I could. All the things that Google at that time said would help. I was getting massages on my neck that was supposed to open blood flow into my brain and help it heal. So I was doing any and everything I could. And so I don't know what helped. I really don't know. I'm a big believer that exercise and the support I had from an incredible community had a big part to it. My parents would say the same thing. But what I always tell people is fill your toolbox with as many tools as you can, and then utilize all of them. And maybe 2 of them will work. But for the people I see struggling months and months with concussion, if the time that you have to put in to try all those tools, you waste time trying all of them and 2 of them work, if I asked any of those individuals struggling, I know they say it'd be worth it. And I've talked to people that have. So in conclusion, I was, after 2 years away from the game, an incredible 2 years of being welcomed back into the team in Kitchener, I was allowed to play hockey again. I finished 3 more years with the Kitchener Rangers. I was blessed and lucky to be the captain in my final year. I was lucky enough to go to an NHL camp with the New York Rangers. Obviously, I didn't make it because I'm standing here right now and they're playing. You can laugh at me, it's okay. And the best of all was I won an award for the Humanitarian of the Year in the CHL, and it was for no other reason than talking about concussion and sharing it and empowering individuals to recover. Telling people to fill that toolbox and educate each other. Let's share this research. I don't understand it at the research level, but let's break it down so that if I understand it, you can understand it, and then you can tell the next person, and we can empower everyone to recover from concussion, because nothing upsets me more than seeing my teammates, my neighbors, struggling with something that people can't see and dealing with the social effects of that. And let's fill that toolbox and use every tool you can. And if you think you've used every tool, go find more. There's so many people I talk to that say, yeah, I tried the omegas, it's not working. Well, let's try something else. Let's look at the latest research and try something else, because there's more. And that's how we empower recovery. So now we'll get to our presentation today, now that you know a little bit about me. Alrighty, so the other thing about me that I didn't share was that I have a podcast that I started a year ago. It was a hobby. It started as a crazy idea, and then after 365 days, it's something that I do part-time, and I'm getting emails from all over, and it's been a life-changing experience. Someone on the foundation that I work with said, why don't you pair the foundation you work with concussion, with the podcast, and now share that research on the podcast so that people can hear it and you can simplify it. And that's what I've done for the past 3 months, and it's been incredible. So that's what I'm going to do here today, is have an open conversation, ask as many questions as I can. And the best part is I don't know much about the science side of these things, so I ask questions that you may be asking. And that's why this podcast has been such a cool thing. So we'll start with the eyes. And the most exciting thing I learned about concussion and the eyes is it's not necessarily the eyes that are injured with a concussion. There's more to it. And it's the brain. There's something going on in the brain or the body that is then telling the eyes what to see, and it's causing issues. So it's not necessarily the issue with the eyes. So I wondered, Dr. Dalton, if we could start with optometry, this topic of the eyes and concussion, and I guess go into, is it on? Yeah, it's on. We're good? Oh, okay. What are the issues beyond an eye exam that would come from a concussion? Not just more than just being able to see letters from a distance. I guess, what are the other issues that could come from a concussion in the eyes?
So the vision is really actually a complex system. There's kind of three big parts to it that we talk about. So there's the actual basic optical system and the structure of the eye. So that's the actual eyeball itself, and that's the place that we see things with. It takes in light, and it starts the processing. But that optical system is connected then right into our brain with a hot wire with a nerve right into the back of the brain. And the brain then forms the perceptual system, or the second part of our vision system, and that's where all that information that comes into the eye is then interpreted, and then decisions are made on how to use that information, including decisions on how to move the eyes. And so both of those pieces need to be working together and properly, whether it's be a structural problem from damage to the optical system, or in the case of a concussion or a brain injury, there's a damage to the perceptual system that impacts then how the optical system functions. But the third piece that's part of that is actually the other piece we don't always talk about, but is also very common in brain injury, is the vestibular system. The vestibular system primarily rests in our ears and is responsible for maintaining our balance, but the vestibular system is also really important in actually controlling our eye movements. So the vestibular system generates this thing called the vestibular ocular reflex. And as the head turns any position, it's actually that reflex that adjusts your eyes, so you're always looking where you want to look straight. And concussion can affect the vestibular system, it can affect the brain, and if you get hit hard enough, it can actually do damage to the optical system of the eye. So when you come in for a basic eye exam, we check first the optical system, and if there's no problems there, then we're going to start looking at the function, which starts to tease out some of the perceptual pieces, and we can expand on testing then to look also at the vestibular system and more in depth how that perception system's working.
And if that is one of the issues and someone goes to see an optometrist, how are issues like that rectified? Is it medication? Is it a certain type of therapy that then people can work through?
The problem, so how we fix things depends on where you have issues, really. So if you have structural issues in the eye, we can either look at those. Maybe if it's severe trauma to the eye or bone fractures in the face, it could be starting with surgery to fix that trauma, right? If the eye itself is intact and there's no major damage to it, then it might be something like glasses. If it's more of a functional problem, so the eye is working well and seeing well, but maybe the two eyes don't work together well, or maybe the perceptual system is miscalibrated or isn't working as efficiently as it could be, then it's things like vision training, exercises that are designed to help strengthen either functional mechanics in the eyes or maybe help you relearn to see and interpret your visual environment around you. And that perceptual training could be in combination with other healthcare professionals like physiotherapists, massage therapists, anyone else you can also help open up that stuff, because the eye by itself won't fix everything.
And would you have a specific example of how someone doing physiotherapy or some other type of therapy with a different specialist than an optometrist can actually affect the eyes, maybe directly or indirectly?
So there's lots of really interesting examples where we'll see concussion patients that have a lot of vision problems, but sometimes they seem to be worse on one side than the other. So one eye seems to be worse, or it seems to, when they look in a certain direction, that side of their body seems to have they have more issues looking to one side than the other. And oftentimes we find with those patients, if we're working also with physiotherapy, massage, maybe chiropractor, and we get a lot of work done on the neck, or maybe even possibly the jaw with a good dentist, we can actually help rebalance things so there's not an asymmetry between them.
That's incredible. I know so many people that have reached out to me saying, I feel this issue, I feel that issue, and I did a podcast with someone about the eyes as well, and it was a story about how there was an issue with the shoulder that was causing them to have their head a certain way. So when their eyes were looking a certain way, it was throwing everything else off, and that was giving them their symptoms and the concussion. And it's incredible to hear that we can, I guess, fix those issues.
We can try to fix them. We can't always fix everything.
Right.
With every concussion, and I tell all my patients, if it's a really major injury, we may not get back to 100%, but we're going to try to get back as much as we can. Right.
Right. And do we see any trends in vision and concussion right now, in a sense of if this is an issue, whether it's convergence or another type of visual issue, that there are trends of the time it's going to take to recover?
At this point in time, we don't know. we talk about research, and you talk about being behind the 8 ball. Research in vision is even further behind than most of the other research. Vision hasn't been a big part of the conversation along the way up until probably in the last maybe 5 or 6 years that we've started talking about it. So we don't know a lot yet as to what happens to the vision system and what sort of timelines there are for visual recovery after concussion. We're still trying to write those studies and do those studies. But there is some interesting research coming out that prolonged vision symptoms sometimes, or prolonged vestibular symptoms in people who aren't recovery. If you have vision or vestibular symptoms, sometimes they can be predictive of prolonged recovery. Right. So we're starting to see it's an important component, but we don't have the whole story yet.
And have you had any experiences and specific examples? Again, I think having certain examples people can relate to and realize maybe it's not my concussion, maybe it's something else. And have you seen examples, and I know you touched on this earlier, of people you've dealt with that had issues beforehand, before the concussion, that once the concussion happened, it just made things even worse? I wonder if you had examples of that.
There's lots of these. So it's interesting, because with vision, if we find a glasses prescription, we know very well that's based on how long your eye is and how strong the optic components of your eye are. That determines whether or not you have a glasses prescription or not. What's really interesting is that when you get a concussion, that glasses prescription doesn't suddenly become manifest, your eye doesn't change shape, but sometimes you can no longer compensate for wear that glasses prescription and maybe get away without wearing glasses or without needing some extra help. And so that is an issue that predated the injury, but prior to the injury you could compensate fine. Now you've got to relearn to compensate, and sometimes that can be as simple as adding in some glasses and then doing some extra training to help you relearn how to use them, and that can kind of rebalance things. Sometimes it's more complicated.
Interesting. And is there anything nutrition-wise? I know this is a newer field in regards to concussion, like you said, with vision, but I wondered if nutrition at all has crossed paths with vision. And the only reason I ask is one of your students, who I'm lucky enough to be a coach of, had brought up the idea of kale, and that kale's really good for the eyes. And I wondered, whether it's concussion or not, if you had an opinion on nutrition, or if people say, hey, you should eat this because it helps with vision and it helps with concussion recovery. Are there any myths out there that you could debunk?
Nutrition and vision is an area that so a big area where it's come out of is actually with macular degeneration, which is a condition that causes you to lose your sight, and typically happens in older people. And the macula is an area that's very dense in antioxidants, and so they're starting to find that some of the nutrients and antioxidants may have a protective effect, or may be able to even improve vision in people who are at risk of loss, or possibilities of changes in that particular disease. And they're looking at it in sports performance to try and enhance vision as well. But nutrition's always really hard to study because it's so multifaceted. But there are other things, like making sure you're well hydrated. We know good nutrition is good for lots of things, including brain health and eye health. So getting enough vitamins, getting enough water, those are also really, really big things you can be doing. Do we have the science yet? We're getting there, but it's a hard topic to study.
Interesting. And in conclusion, I love when you talk about the importance of vision and concussion, because it is so powerful, and even going off the numbers, if you could, just the chances of, or what the percentages are right now of those that suffer from concussion, the amount of people that also have vision issues. And I wondered if you could just sum things up with how important vision is and getting it looked at and taken care of when dealing with concussion.
So in some of the research and in patients we see, you can see some of the studies will say up to 90% of people who have a concussion will complain of vision symptoms at some point during the recovery. And those seem to be quite high in people with persistent symptoms as well. So 60, 70, 80% of people with persistent symptoms will often have vision symptoms. I think with those kind of numbers, it's really important to at least get the eye exam done, to have it looked at, because you can either say, right, I've got vision stuff here, I can get help with it, or hey, my vision system's actually normal, that's not the source of my problems, I can stop worrying about something and focus on what isn't.
Perfect. All righty, we'll move on to sports medicine with Dr. Mountjoy. So I think the first thing we could start off with, and I touched on it when I opened, is the importance of Rowan's Law. I guess a little bit of how that came to be and how it's making an impact today, and exactly what it does.
So our Rowan's Law is named after a young athlete from Ottawa. She was a teenager, and she suffered a concussion and was told that she didn't actually tell anybody she had this concussion, And she went back and played again a day later and suffered another head injury. And unfortunately, she was one of the very rare cases that actually died as a result of the second impact syndrome. And it was her death that that really was the instigating factor for this law, hence the name Rowan's Law. And it came into effect at the end of September 2018, so it is now law in Ontario. And the last Wednesday in every September will be officially across Ontario known as Rowan's Day, raising awareness for concussion. Now this Bill 153 received royal assent and is law, and it has 4 components, and these 4 components are on the slide that you will see. And it involves many different recommendations. There's about 49 recommendations in general. It's related to education, it's related to returning to sport, returning to life, and there's coaches involved. And this law requires every sport organization and school and anyone dealing with the young population that could be at risk, that they have these rules and regulations in place. So I consider this a positive outcome to a tragedy, that this tragedy could then now people will listen and act and help to prevent the second impact syndrome. I think the main message is that she played again with a concussion. And if you can remember anything from tonight, when in doubt, sit them out. If there's been a head hit that you're wondering if it's a concussion, please don't send them back into play. Please have them checked by a physician, by a clinician, and then we can say for certain they're okay, or thank you, you didn't put them back, we need to treat them. So let's all learn from her tragedy and help prevent it in other children, other players, and adults as well.
It leads right into sideline screening and the importance of that to ensure we're not putting young athletes or older athletes back into play when they may be at risk or may have a concussion that initially may not appear as a concussion. So I wondered if you could touch a little bit on what the sideline screening is, how it works, and when do we do it? Do we wait a couple hours? Do we do it right away? And I guess what are some of the signs people should be looking for that they may not know would lead to, hey, this person might have a concussion?
Right, so that's a very good question. What do we do? What if we're at our child's hockey game or soccer game, and what are we supposed to do? Well, I can tell you now with Rowan's Law, all coaches must have training every year in this, and there should be trained people on site that can do an assessment at the sidelines. Now, the sideline assessment is based on what's called the Sport Concussion Assessment Tool, and this is a worldwide recommendation from the Berlin World Conference held a few years ago. Now, this sideline screening is not a diagnosis. The diagnosis is done 48 hours by a physician, but this screening is done right on the field of play. Remove the athlete into a quiet area where you can have a quiet conversation and assessment, and you're looking for things like, do you know who you are? Do you know where you are? So orientation. You're asking if they have any symptoms, headache, visual symptoms. How is your balance? And is there any trauma to their face? And if there's any suspicion that those things are there, that's when you say, okay, your day on the field is done. Parents are brought in, or a responsible person is brought in to help and assist, and encouraged to go see their physician, sport clinician, within 24 to 48 hours for a proper assessment.
That's awesome. I think an important point you brought up was the screening and diagnosis, and the difference between that, I think, is often confused I know it's confused in the sporting world, is that we have people that aren't actually capable or trained to diagnose, and they screen and say, oh, this person must have a concussion. So then that individual goes home and lays in the dark for 3 days, and then on day 3 feels a little bit depressed and a little bit anxious, and might not actually have a concussion. So that's why it's the importance of becoming educated, and if you have the ability to and resources, go to a reliable person, someone that is trained to diagnose, so that those symptoms don't come up just because you've sat alone for 3 days. And I've unfortunately seen that occur. So it's the importance, again, of this whole thing and that education. Another question I have, and I don't mean to put you on the spot with this, but I might anyways. when someone does a screening on the sidelines, should we be extra careful if we have any feeling in our stomach? Because can people pass the screening and seem fine but still have a concussion, or have you seen cases of that?
Not really. It's a pretty low threshold. And I think if there's any doubt, get professional help. You know, we have one brain, and we can't replace it. So let's be careful with these brains. And if there's anything on that sideline screen, it's simple questions, and I think it came up on the screen. They're fairly simple questions that anyone can ask on the side. And then that's a trigger to say, go in and get it checked. So I don't really see people that have gone through the sideline screen and it turned out to be a concussion afterwards. Really the contrary. In fact, at the university here with all our teams, we have the sideline concussion screening comes in with the athlete and becomes part of their chart. So I can then compare what I'm seeing a day or two later with what actually someone saw at the sidelines. So it's actually a very nice little document that the athlete can take with them to their physician to say, well, here's why I came in, because the check boxes are in these boxes. And then see what the change is over the last day or two to compare.
An interesting point on that is that when we were at a meeting one day talking about the screening and understanding if someone has a concussion or not, at the NHL level, I was lucky enough to speak with a doctor that's on the NHLPA board and meeting with all the concussion spotters. And I don't know if everyone in here knows what they are, but the concussion spotters would be up top in the arena, and if someone takes a certain hit that appears they might have a concussion, they have to go into the room and be checked. And this doctor was on the phone with all these concussion concussion spotters at the same time. And he asked the question, for those that aren't big hits, when guys sustain a concussion and it's not from a big hit that you can see and it's obvious, how do you know that they are concussed? How is it that you figure that out? And across the board, all of them said because of their teammates. Because the people that know them best spoke up and said, hey, you need to check out number so-and-so because he's acting a little bit different. And so again, going off of the importance of this, maybe there isn't the sideline screening, but the importance of that education for all of us in here to tell our siblings, our friends, our children of the information we're learning, so that they're the ones that are probably going to say, hey, you need to look at Jack or Sarah or whoever it is that they're not acting right. And that's the screening process happening all on its own, peer-to-peer.
And I use that clinically too. When I see someone with a concussion, 99% of the time I request that they have someone come with them if they can. A parent, friend, girlfriend, teammate. And that's often a question I say. At the time when there was the hit, did they seem normal to you? And they know. They know whether or not they said, they weren't making sense, or they were walking not their same way. And that's often what we see as one of the first signs is balance, the balance being off. And they can say, they weren't skating or they weren't walking the way they should have and their balance was off, or personality. That's how often I know they're feeling better. When we get into the treatment, I say to mom and dad, so how are they now? And they say, oh, boy, they're chatty and back to their normal behavior and attitude is back. And I think, great. But before, they were quiet and lying on the couch and they were irritable. So now they're back to their cheery self again. So having that second person who knows them best is often one of the best indicators that I use in clinical reassessment for returning to play or returning back to learn.
Ironically, that's what actually led me back to my 2 years when I wasn't playing to be with my team in Kitchener. Was they took me off the anti-seizure medication. Symptoms started to subside somewhat. I started to get my energy back, and my mom was like, okay, I can't handle you again. Full of energy, 16 years old, wanted to get out of the house, and she said, maybe you should go back into routine. And I think it was one of the best things I ever did. So once the screening process is done, moving into the SCAT-5, which I think is something people should know about, that next step and what it's telling us, what it does, and I guess what it doesn't do. I think there's importance to that. Maybe there's things it doesn't tell us that we might assume it does. So I wondered if you could go into the SCAT-5.
So SCAT-5 stands for Sport Concussion Assessment Tool, and we'll say it's the 5th edition. And this was because the most recent conference that I said was in Berlin, the World Conference on Concussion, was the 5th World Conference. So this is the SCAT-5. And it is a tool that physicians should use in their office. It's a standardized tool, and it's a tool to aid in the diagnosis of concussion. Concussion is different in every case, and it's a syndrome of constellation of different symptoms, and it helps a physician diagnose concussion. It is one of the tools that we use in diagnosis. And the beauty of the SCAT is I can do it at different intervals when an athlete comes in, and I can see progress over time. If I'm lucky to have a SCAT-5 done before the season started, I can compare where they're at now with before their injury. And I can compare it as they move along their progress and see how they improve in their symptom score or their balance score as time moves on. So it's a helpful tool to have. It's certainly not the only thing I use in the diagnosis, but it's a very helpful tool that most physicians can easily download for free off the internet and use it as part of their clinical chart.
Is there an optimal time to do the SCAT-5? Is there a time that's too early or too late to do the test?
Well, there's no time best before due date, but we encourage that if you have an assessment by a clinician within 24 to 48 hours. And certainly that's our policy here at the clinic. If someone calls with a concussion, they don't get an appointment 2 weeks later. They get one as soon as we feasibly can get them in. If it's a Friday night concussion, we might not see them till Monday morning. It's the best we can do. And that's usually okay within 24 to 48 hours. And then we repeat it at different periods along the way to assess their progress.
Following along the SCAT-5, going into the time it takes to recover, I think an interesting point that I was definitely curious about, and I know a little bit about it now, what is the normal time to recover, and what would be an extended period of recovery?
So anything over 4 weeks in a child is considered an extended period, and over 2 weeks in an adult. Okay. We used to say 90% will heal within 7 days. Not really in my reality. Most of them take a little longer than that.
And your approach with the tools that you use in screening and recovery and dealing with patients quite often, what is your opinion, and I know we're going to get into this further next, but your opinion on return to learn and return to life, I guess, return to sport, all that. I guess can that all work together? Is it possible? Should one come before the other?
That's a very good question. And I always tell my patients when I see them that we are going to do return to learn or work before we do return to play. And that's just a bias I have, that I think we have to have the ability to have school or work for the rest of our lives, and sport is something for fun on top of that. So we do prioritize, or I prioritize, return to learn. Now that changes a little bit first if you are a professional athlete. So if you're a professional athlete, your work is your sport. So it is slightly modified in the elite athlete, but really returning to normal life of learning and working. Now, we try to focus on that first. However, you can do some of the physical activity work while you're returning to learn. So we do it. We don't finish the learn and then start physical activity. It's done at the same time, but really you're not back to full competition and play until you're first back to school and or work.
Fantastic. I think we'll move on to the physiotherapy side of things now. So we'll chat with Brett here. When it comes to, and I find this cool, it's kind of cross paths with what we chatted about with optometry, and what I talked about when I opened up is let's give people as many tools as we can. And we'll start with just that simple question. How important and how much opportunity is there to recover from concussion with physiotherapy-based tools and techniques?
So I think there's tremendous opportunity to recover from a concussion. Similar to any other injury that you would have, Ben, I like to think that there's a window of opportunity where you're probably going to have a better chance of a quicker recovery. So it was great for Dr. Mountjoy to mention 24 to 48 hours to see them, and then what we want to do after that period is to start activity as quickly as we can. Now the important caveat to that is that that activity, be it cognitive activity or physical activity, has to be done below what the symptom threshold is. So you don't want to make your symptoms worse while you're doing those things, but you certainly want to increase activity as quickly as you can below that symptom threshold to be able to speed up recovery. And there's good evidence that's coming out now that would suggest that is possible. So one of the tools that I would say is early access to medical management and early access to exercise activity as well.
And going off of that, I think it's important to note that there are modifications that can be made to do things without reaching that symptom threshold. I wondered what are the changes you can make to certain exercises or certain movements that would allow someone to, let's say, bike or run or play catch below and some examples, I guess, some real life examples that you would use with patients of, okay, maybe you can't do this full speed, but here's another way to do it.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a really good question, and it's a really complicated question and answer as well, because concussion is such a multifaceted thing. There's so many things that can impact on the symptoms that people are experiencing at the time that they're recovering. So based on the activities that we do, I rely heavily on Dr. Mountjoy's assessment of how they're doing. I rely on Dr. Dalton's assessment of how the visual system is doing. I rely on the assessment of our speech language pathologist, the entire team, to determine all of the different components to that particular person's concussion. I like to say that concussions are like snowflakes, no two are the same. So if you're creating an exercise regime for someone, you really have to focus on the various aspects of that particular person that are leading to those symptoms, and then you try and challenge those particular systems. So as an example, there may be someone who has a higher resting heart rate and they score really high on anxiety and depression and those sorts of scales. Those are people that you probably want to exercise really hard, be able to monitor their symptoms while they're doing it, be able to monitor their heart rate while they're doing it as well. So then what you can say is, if you have those exercise things and you start to get those symptoms, now we know that, well, you were able to get your heart rate up to 140 beats per minute before that happened. So I know that we can safely exercise you below that threshold, and we're not causing any undue harm or concern to the concussion as well. Another thing that's important to point out when you're exercising someone or when you're doing some sort of physical activity in the return to life process is that even though we're challenging these systems, and even though you might feel kind of crappy after doing some of these things, that's a normal thing, and we need to challenge these systems to be able to get the adaptation that's required for us to heal. So I think it's really important, the education piece, to be able to tell people that even though you're doing things that may increase your symptoms, that's not actually causing further injury. The concussion happened, you got hit into the boards, you had that injury, that process is going to take some time. What we can do is we can challenge all those symptoms. That doesn't mean that you've got another concussion again as well. So when you're looking at those various aspects of concussion, you're planning out various activities based on all of those things. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
It was a complex question you said, so that was a great answer. And to me, that's one of my favorite topics right now in head injury and concussion management, especially with a sport background. I think it's so empowering that we can now, instead of say, go home, leave the rink, stay away from all these people and your friends for 5 days to a week, here are some tools you can use. Don't go run full speed, let's run at 10% maybe. I think now that we know, and we're research, like you said, is moving in that direction, I think is one of the most empowering things, and something, again, that we can share with people that may be struggling. When it comes to recovery, the therapy you do, and someone that may have had a prior concussion, do you see trends of people that take longer to recover, knowing they've had prior concussion, or are there not trends with that? Because I've heard a lot of mixed opinions on exactly this, and I don't know if that's, again, being in the sporting world, some people like to lie, obviously. So to clear the air on that, in your experience, working one-on-one with these people, does prior concussion usually lead to a longer recovery?
So that's a good question, too. So while anecdotally you can hear that if you've had 2-3 concussions, it's probably going to take you longer to recover, the evidence to date doesn't necessarily completely support that. Now, there is some evidence that would say that a history of past concussions can lead to a protracted recovery from concussion, but there's also a lot of evidence out there to say that a previous history of concussion does not necessarily confer that you're going to have a prolonged recovery for your next concussion. So each concussion, like I said, is going to be different. Now, there are a few things that are different if you've had a previous concussion. Typically, the severity of the symptoms afterwards is increased as well. So we know that the likelihood of you feeling crappy is probably going to be higher if you've had a previous concussion, and that is also linked to a longer recovery. So the chances are that there may be an increase in concussion, but we don't know that for sure yet. The second thing is that a history of previous concussion makes you more susceptible to future concussions as well.
I think it's important to, and I've realized this as I've now sat down with more people in research and in the leading edge of these conversations and on the research floor, is that when they say, no, we don't know that yet, or research doesn't show that, I think is just as powerful. Because of all the rumors in this field, it's just as powerful for them to say, no, that's actually not true, or no, research does not support that, so that you can block out the things that people are saying, hey, do this, eat that, do this exercise, and that'll work. It's just as powerful when people like yourselves say, no, that's not true, and it's important to be aware of that. Does any type of stretching or therapy, I touched on what I went through, and I might mess this word up, sacrocranial manipulation. I don't know if that's the right way to say it.
Craniosacral manipulation.
Yes,
yeah.
You did it better.
Yeah.
So I guess different things like that. Is there validity to that? Does that help, or is it just another tool we can throw in our toolbox that might help?
So there's no smoking gun in concussion. There's no silver bullet. So you really do have to be careful about saying that one particular treatment over another is going to be the end-all be-all when it comes to concussion as well. There's a really good document put out by the Canadian Academy of Sports and Exercise Medicine, which talks about the 4 characteristics of a good concussion clinic. And one of the things that they talk about, there's a few red flags at the end as well. So when you're looking for treatment for certain things, one of the things to look for is that the clinic shouldn't charge a different fee for concussion management compared to what their regular treatment is. The other thing is that they shouldn't be purporting to utilize one particular treatment that's going to improve concussion rates. Like we said, there's no one particular tool that is going to be used. If I have my golf bag, I'm not going to go on the golf course and just take my driver for 18 holes. I need to use a lot of different tools to be able to properly manage the golf course. It's the same thing with concussion as well. And the other thing to look for is to beware of anything that talks about testimonials where they were cured in a miraculous fashion based upon some of the treatment techniques that were used there. So certainly there's merit to a lot of the different tools that are used. What we go by at our clinic, and what I think the majority or all good concussion clinics do, is that they go by the consensus statement that is held every 4 years. So every 4 years, what happens is some very, very smart people get together and look at all of the articles that have been written about concussion in the previous 4 years, in Berlin, when we were there, it was over 52,000 articles that were reviewed. So you may be able to pull one particular article from a particular journal from one part of the world that says such and such of this treatment was effective and significantly reduced treatment times and improved recovery and that sort of thing. But if it doesn't stand up to the rigors of the scientific method that the international consensus statement purports to, then you really have to be questionable about that.
That's great. That's great. I think we'll move into the pediatric concussion protocols now to sum things up. The one point I will make off that before we continue is to be skeptical of the research you're reading in this field. One of the episodes I did on the podcast was about CTE, and if I'm being completely open and honest with everyone in this room, that's a worry I have of neurodegenerative issues. It's something that is kind of in the back of my mind, and instead of avoiding it, the tough thing I've had to do is go out and research as much as I can about it. Because of what I went through, I don't want that to happen to me, and not for myself, but for my family. So going off of that, this topic of CTE, I decided to do an episode on it, and what I learned was a lot of the research on CTE right now is with such a specific population. And they're pulling research out, these messages, and going back to the fear-mongering, saying, if you have too many concussions, you're going to get CTE. And what the funny remark this individual told me was, the cover of the paper doesn't say another football player died of high blood pressure or cholesterol, because it's not sexy and it doesn't sell, but what does sell is CTE. So let's do another really specific research article on CTE that we can tailor to show terrible results. And so if you look at all the CTE research, and I won't say all of it, a large majority of it is with these football players that also have issues outside of just concussion, the high stress, the poor home environment, et cetera, et cetera. So we haven't done research to show that does a poor home environment and anxiety and drug use or steroid use or whatever lead to CTE. So it's interesting going off of your point. And I share that because I don't know if there's anyone else in this room that has that fear. I certainly do, and it was a big relief for me, is that the importance of learning about this research, and look where the research came from and why they're saying it, where are they getting their sources from, so that you know their information's valid. Perfect. Going on to the pediatric concussion care and a couple other topics as well. I'll lean over here. So the first thing I enjoyed about the information I looked over of yours, and one of the most empowering messages for me was what rest is and what rest really means. And I know we've kind of touched on that, but what does rest mean when it comes to concussion recovery?
Well, thank you for having me here, and I think going last is a bit daunting after all these other experts. So you'll hear some things that repeat, but you'll get my spin on them. What does rest really mean? Well, rest doesn't mean, and I'll start with that, it doesn't mean social isolation. It doesn't mean sensory deprivation. It doesn't mean putting somebody in a dark room. Those days are gone, but I feel it's important, and when Ben and I spoke, to mention this, because in fact, some people still believe this. It means taking it easy for the first 24 to 48 hours. And we've learned that, in fact, rest is still important, just as if you were not well or you had any other kind of injury, you would rest naturally a little bit. But you can start to do your daily activities very early. You can start to do things that, as we've heard, do not make your symptoms go higher. But in fact, rest does not mean doing nothing. And I think that's what so many people were made to do in the early days of concussion, and we now know very clearly from the research that too much rest is bad and in fact makes symptoms worse. And makes people perhaps have symptoms go on longer. And may I just say, from a pediatric perspective, the parents would say to me, I can't make them rest. Like, what are you talking about? You've got to come up with something better. And that's in fact what we have tried to do, something that is realistic, that is manageable, and that incorporates rest, but also incorporates some activity for the kids. And it's a good concept for adults as well.
Kids are in a different spot in their life than adults, so there is a little bit of different care needed. There's different social settings. And to begin that conversation, I guess, what are the new pediatric concussion protocols that have recently come out and that everyone here can be aware of and take note of?
Well, we've been very fortunate at CanChild and at McMaster University and McMaster Children's Hospital that we've had funding from the government, Canadian Institutes for Health Research, starting in 2012 to really try and develop guidelines that were pediatric specific. But they were based on and very similar to the Berlin Consensus guidelines that are used for adult athletes, but they weren't working for families. Families would come into clinic and it was clear they just weren't knowing how to implement them with their children. Kids were getting repeat injuries like crazy, even though they were theoretically following these adult guidelines. So we embarked on a great community project with our physicians, with colleagues in Guelph and a lot of places to try and find out what people wanted and needed for kids. They wanted to know what to do. Parents wanted to know what specifically does rest mean, just like you've asked. How long should they do this? What can't they do? What should they do? So we established the first guidelines with, again, reviewing all the evidence, which there wasn't much in those days, and particularly related to children, and came out with the pediatric return to activity, called Activity Not Sport, because as many parents and families will say, and many kids get their injuries not in sport, even though a great majority still do. They have falls, they're in dance, they're et cetera. So they're called Return to Activity Guidelines, and the other is Return to School. And many people will talk about Return to Learn. We particularly say return to school because it's really important. The first stage is to get the child early and quickly back into the school environment, into their normal routine. And so I don't care if they're sitting in school for a half an hour and just seeing their friends and then they go home. They got to school, because sometimes even driving to school, or certainly don't take the bus. So those were the first guidelines that came out in around 2013. We revised them again in 2017. We got more funding, and we have really gone to town to incorporate all this new information on rest and what constitutes a more specific guideline for families. And that's what you see upstairs. We brought some for you. We've had adults that kind of follow them from a work perspective because it kind of helps them too, but they are geared for particularly the 5 to 18 age group. But one of the things that is a little controversial about them, and we've already, I think Ben's trying to stir up controversy when he asked you the same question. Can you put return to school and return to sport/activity together? And Berlin Consensus was very ambiguous about this. They said it in a way that it was really not clear what it meant. It said you couldn't go back to sport until you had fully gone back to school. Well, there are caveats to that, and we've just spent a lot of years doing research, following kids forward in time to see how they follow return to school and return to play, and did they do them together, what happened, et cetera, et cetera. And we have concluded that, in fact, they can do them together up to a point, which is really what you said. But they should start some activity straight away, just with school. And also, you don't get buy-in. You know, when I tell a young man in clinic, no, I'm sorry, you can't do any of that hockey stuff at all. And well, what do you mean? Well, why should I go to school? And then you have the kids that are so anxious about missing school. So basically, you have to come up with something that they get buy-in on both. And so we have, if you have them in your hand, you'll see a little model on how the two guidelines can actually integrate, which means you can do return to school and return to activity together up until stage 3, which is going back to school with accommodation and starting some sport-specific activity, but not with your team. And then you go ahead and finish school, or at least get up to your full performance at school, and then you go into your contact sport. So people just were not clear. It seemed to be an all or none. So we're trying to get that together. So that's probably one of the newest things, in addition to the rest and the more specificity of the guidelines. That too is a long answer.
Oh, that's great. That's great. A point you brought up, and I think this is great for anyone in here dealing with children. It's actually kind of a good visual for adults too, I think, is the snakes and ladders approach of recovery. And I thought I would let you explain that. I think it's fun. I think it gives people a visual. I think the one issue with head injury and concussion, not only in sport, is that it's hard to see an achievement. Okay,
Right.
if I get to stage 2, what is that? What do I feel like? What if I go back to stage 1 and it's not a visual? And I think a visual helps people. So I thought you could go into the snakes and ladders approach.
Well, it's interesting. We like to use analogies, particularly with kids, but you really like this one, so that's good. And a number of people do, so I think we're going to stick with it. It's fairly hot off the press. But the recovery of the snakes and ladders idea, and if any of you have experienced concussion, I think there are people here who have or know people who have, they go along pretty nicely and maybe progress through the 6 stages of the guidelines or protocols, whatever you call them. But they maybe get to stage 3 and they've done something too much. They've overdone it. So then they kind of slide back and have to go back to the next step. So that's why we call it snakes and ladders. You can go ahead and progress up those ladders, but if you've done too much. And that's what is so absolutely individual. I can't give a recipe for what you should do or what you should do, because it's going to depend on your symptoms, what you've done in your lifestyle that makes those symptoms come back, and just might make you slide back. But then it makes you more aware of what it is that causes your symptoms, and then you start back up the next stage of ladders. So that's why we kind of talk about it in terms of, and eventually you get to the end of the board and win the game.
In that whole process of the snakes and ladders approach, and hopefully it's a one road, we don't have to slide back. But if we do, another interesting point you brought up, which I liked, was the idea of energy conservation and energy use, and how that relates to concussion. If we're putting too much energy into a simple task, or vice versa, if we're just pushing ourselves too hard, I wondered your opinion and approach to our energy when we're dealing with concussion.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it's a little bit of a build on the question that you asked, Brett, about how do you adapt activities or gear them down. And so, again, with kids, we speak about the analogy of keeping your gas tank full. Because if you do too many things that drain the tank or go down too low, you're probably going to get symptoms. So you want to keep your energy up and your fuel up so that you can do the things that you love to do, the things that you want to do, and the things that you need to do. And it's pretty basic energy conservation techniques, but it's instead of like a young woman or the mother and the daughter, we said it's okay for you to start doing some things. Well, away they went. Called me that next day. Well, we went to the mall, and then we came back and had a family dinner, and then there was a birthday party the next day. And I don't understand why she's now having terrible headaches again. So they weren't conserving energy. They just blew it all out as soon as they got permission to go to the next level. So it's really a balance, and I'm thinking that's the hardest thing that we humans have to do. Like we're not real good with balance. We're really good with all or none. And in concussion, a good recovery requires balance and some energy conservation. You just don't go crazy doing everything at once. You have to do a little bit at a time. And then also keeping the fuel up there in the tank full is good sleep and good nutrition. Again, things that have been mentioned already.
I find that point interesting. Again, going off of the people that have asked me for support in this field in concussion, and I found I've given people a lot of tools that they can use, certain things that I've done or certain things I've learned from amazing people like I'm speaking with here today. I heard Dr. Dalton say this, or I heard Brett say this, maybe you should try this. And because it's such a frustrating issue, people will often allow themselves to slide back down the ladder. And I'm talking often with people that are above the drinking age and maybe are out too late, or abuse certain things or certain hobbies they may have, and then they come to me and say, yeah, it's not working, I'm doing the stuff you're saying, but what extra stuff are you doing that you're not saying that is really causing the length of symptoms to continue on? And so it's tough, and I understand that it's tough, and I think that's a point where we need the support of our peers and people that understand, so that they can tell us, hey, maybe you shouldn't, it's 9 o'clock, you've had a rough day, you've been talking about your headaches, maybe it's time to call it a night. So I think that support's important in making sure that we don't slide down the ladder.
And I just add a little story to that. We hired a fabulous young woman in the summer who'd had 4 concussions, and she was very open about that. And she had got them in basketball. Bright girl, doing really well, finally made it to university, and we have a movie about her actually on our website. She's made a movie because she wants to tell the story and wants to participate in concussion awareness. But she would sit there with us, and she helped us make the guidelines, and I could see the headache coming. You know, you could just see her pallor come, and she was pushing herself to the limit, and she was in a concussion team, and I was her boss, and like I think you need to go. I think turn out the lights, stop reading, turn off your computer, and it's very hard. And she does the same thing with her classes. Why are you taking 5 classes? Well, you know, I can do it, but do you really want to have that headache every day? So it is very difficult for people to do that balance that we talk about and cut back.
I find there's a lot of similarities between mental health and concussion, as in they're not seen, and there's the social issues and the seclusion, et cetera. And going off of what you said, when I talk at high schools or elementary schools and we're talking mental health, we talk about a pot. Everyone has a pot that they have of the amount of things they can handle, and you have the ability to go in and take things out of the pot so it doesn't boil over. And the same thing with concussion. So if we're talking, well, I guess initially if we're talking with anxiety and you have all these things on your plate, conversations you're avoiding because you don't want to have them, you know, you should go in and have those tough conversations because it's going to take those things out of your pot so it doesn't boil over. Same thing with concussion, and that energy conservation is, maybe it's not going to the mall as much as you want to go. Maybe it's not listening to the music in your headphones on full volume, as awesome as that is. And what little things can I take out of that pot so that I have the energy to recover? Because you also need energy for your immune system to be working and all that recovery to happen. So I'm starting to speak over my pay grade, so I'll go back to you in a point you brought up about how do we deliver this information to how do we deliver this information, the information you just shared or that we all shared, to children so that they buy in and I think this can even be related to adults that maybe haven't totally bought into this whole process. I wondered how you approach that.
Well, I think one of the ways we just talked about a little bit, using the different analogies and making sure kids understand it. But we have just finished one of our big studies, and one of the most, I think, important things we have discovered is that we found that if children understand and have the knowledge about concussion and what they should do after, it is the best predictor of them following protocols and doing better. So we have to include the kids, and many schools have programs, but they're very different, every school, so you can't just say, oh, the school has a program. But the children, or the teams, the coaches, the kids have to know. They have to understand the information, and then they can, as we've also heard, be the person with their peers saying, uh-oh, Johnny just had a bad hit, he should be coming off. But they have to be educated, and we now have some evidence to prove that, yes, we should still educate parents, and yes, we should educate coaches, and yes, we should educate teachers, but we absolutely focus on kids, and that's what we're doing a lot in our more recent activities that we're doing.
Awesome. I think that's all I have, and I think there might be some questions in the audience here. So,
if anyone has any questions,
Mike? Okay, cool. So if anyone has any questions for anyone up here, we'll pass the mic around. And
thank you. That was great. A question for you, taking us away from sports. Large organizations, heavy physical work. You've got employees that maybe bump their head, they get a concussion, it becomes a WSIB claim because it's not a physical injury. It's hard for the leadership team to really have an understanding. And I would also say that from a WSIB perspective, or workmen's compensation, that they're not really well versed on handling that. So what advice would you have for organizations that have employees that suffer from head concussions? And how can we help them get back to work, I guess, and back to life?
Really the same principles apply. It is the same injury, and the brain doesn't discern whether I got it shooting hoops or whether I got it falling on the ice or I got it at work. It's the same result. Of course, as we said, no two are alike, but it is the same process, and as a human being, we heal in a similar nature. So the advice would be concussion awareness, concussion prevention. Where's the hot spot in your industry or in your company where they're occurring? Is it something that you can prevent by changing the rules
And
of the game?
where could you take your supervisory team to get that kind of education? I mean, there's lots of education for supervisors on health and safety. Where is that education around concussions?
Yeah, I think it's a gap.
Okay.
Yeah, but we can apply the principles from sport in it. And I think looking at where these occur, try to prevent them from occurring, having concussion awareness amongst your workers, having the supervisors aware of what it is, these are the same principles that can be applied in industry.
I would just add to that, and as you see, you've got a group of experts here today, and I think just as the school boards and different sports organizations bring us in to train people, I think it's the same principle in industry and work, in the workplace. And certainly the university has started to pay attention, my university, and this one too, I would think. Look at all you guys are here, in terms of approaching that, not just now with the students, but with the employees, in a very graduated return to work, just as we say.
I'm just going to add one practical note. I know that WSIB does have a huge gap when it comes to dealing with concussion management. As physiotherapists, we are dealing with that gap. So I would really recommend making sure that your employee is at a good concussion clinic, because those clinicians will advocate with WSIB, and we do that on a regular basis. There are some specialty concussion clinics. Unfortunately, the way WSIB has it set up under their programs of care, the timeframes are not reflective of these guidelines that are presented at all. So there is a huge gap, and it is a very difficult situation. But in our experience, when we're dealing with WSIB clients, our physiotherapists are on the phone with the adjudicators. We've sent the adjudicators studies. We've sent them CAN-CHILD guidelines. I am a physiotherapist in the community. Our clinic on campus is not a WSIB clinic, so we don't have that experience on campus, but I have lots of other experience. So I would just really want to make sure that you're somewhere that you know that the clinicians are comfortable and educated, because they can definitely advocate for your employees.
And is there a list of these clinics across Ontario? Because the company I work for has employees all over the province.
So there's not a regulatory body that identifies concussion clinics at this point. So part of it is hopefully education like this, being able to recognize affiliations with medical doctors, registered professionals that are on site, good knowledge of evidence-based guidelines. If you happen to be at a clinic just attending this talk, you probably have a half-decent foundation of what you should be hearing. But unfortunately, at this point, there isn't an actual regulation that way.
But I will add to that, the Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation has published on their website within this past year standards, the appropriate standards for concussion clinics. And so what we recommend that people kind of make sure the clinic they're going to meets those standards.
I would just add to that another thing, just to be sort of a buyer beware thing, is that there's lots of different certifications out there, concussion certifications, and no particular certification is recognized by any regulatory bodies or anything like that right now. It's a bit of the Wild West as far as that is. So be careful when you're looking online, and I know everyone is going to say that they treat concussions, that they may have a specific certification, and that's one of the things that's on the CHASM document that I talked about of the characteristics of a good concussion clinic. Be wary of any of the certifications that are out there right now, because there's no standardized certification as of right now for concussion as well.
Hi, I have a question that brings us back to baseline concussion testing. Margot was mentioning that she loves it when her athletes have had a SCAT-5 done as a baseline test. And we've gone through the ups and downs of baseline testing with our hockey junior athletes and other junior athletes, and I know that there's evidence that says that it's not as reliable in the pediatric population. But I also know that when I do a SCAT-5, it doesn't take me as long as it does for what the kids go through when they actually go into baseline concussion testing. So for our young athletes who are younger than 16, younger, like in the novice Adam age group, what is it that we should really be telling family members, parents to be doing for these athletes?
So thank you for raising that. It's a very important question. And prior to the Berlin conference, the most recent number 5, we were told to do neuropsych testing on all children, and that's what's not standardized for children. So what is recommended after Berlin was that we do a SCAT. So that is what we're purporting to do, and that includes a neck examination, that includes balance testing, that includes symptom score. So with that testing is still recommended that we do preseason for all age groups.
Yeah, I was just going to add some really cool research that has just come out recently from the University of Calgary, and they looked at elite hockey players from the ages of 13 to 17, and what they did is preseason testing. So I think it's gotten a little bit muddled in terms of the computerized neuropsych testing being not recommended for baseline testing. But what they did is they looked at a lot of neck function measures before the season in these athletes in Alberta. And what they found, they followed these athletes throughout the season, and they actually found, which is also kind of alarming, that there was a 17% rate of concussion in these kids. But what they found is when they examined these kids afterwards, compared to their baseline, there was a significant change in their neck function in a bunch of different areas. So in terms of neck strength, in terms of neck muscle endurance, in terms of how the neck moves within the space that is allowed for, in terms of how it reacts to any sort of perturbation that's out there. So if we didn't have those measures as a baseline before, we might be losing some of that information about what to do with these kids afterwards as well.
Hi, just for Ben, there was a lot of talk about a comparison in terms of like behavioral aspects, about how there's individuals that you could tell based off their best friends if you knew when they were back. I was wondering if there was an example for you specifically where there was like a point where you said like, I'm back to being me after your concussion.
For me personally, there was a little bit of gray area because they had me on anti-seizure medication. So I didn't know if those symptoms were symptoms of the head injury and whatever other damage had gone on, or it was the anti-seizure medication. It was Dilantin, I believe it was called. I don't know if they use the same medication today. So to say I realized I knew a time, I think for me it was more when exercising didn't make symptoms worse. That's when I knew things were starting to get better. So I used that as a judge. And the crazy thing, I mean, hindsight's 20/20, and a benefit for me was I was doing that back then, as long as my symptoms weren't getting worse, and the doctor I was working with at Hamilton said, you know what, that'll be okay. If the symptoms get worse after your exercise during the day, then don't go do that again. But I would push myself to the point where I could sustain this, the symptoms weren't getting worse. So when I got to that point and could push it harder and harder and harder, and the symptoms were, that's when I realized things were starting to get better. And at that point I was back, I put myself back in school. You know, I was starting to get my energy back. Like I said, my mom kicked me out of the house again. So I'm back in school, I'm getting back into routine. And then they started to take me off the anti-seizure medication. So I think it's hard to say clearly, but it was a mix of being taken off the medication, full routine back in my life, totally immersed in with 23, 16 to 21-year-olds, so you can tell what that environment would be like, stimulated, back with friends, laughing, all of that. So it's hard to say. It's also interesting, and I don't know if research would show it, would putting yourself back into that environment, if it doesn't raise your symptoms, help get rid of the symptoms at all, or get rid of the symptoms totally. So yeah, sorry for the long-winded answer. It was a tough time. There's so many things changing in my life, but I think for me, the biggest indicator was the exercise. Sorry if that doesn't answer the question.
I have a couple of questions. Sneak in too. You guys were talking a little bit about the vulnerability of somebody who has had a concussion and how they are. Yeah, can you talk about that? Oh, somebody who's had a concussion, how they are vulnerable to receiving future concussions or concussions.
Vulnerability to future concussions.
Yeah, repeaters.
The repeaters. I think when I think of repeat concussions, I use an analogy from my own life where I was a high-level soccer player and tore cartilage in my knee, and then the next time I tore cartilage in a ligament, and my knees just don't keep working the same eventually, and I had to retire. When I speak with my athletes or any of my people I'm seeing in clinic, I'm going, okay, we get one, right? We heal. But if you're someone who sprained your ankle 20 times, eventually you sprain your ankle enough, it's not going to work the same way. And so we go the same with a head injury. If you hit it enough times, things just don't work the same way. But where that is for each individual is pretty unique. And we can't predict if it's going to be one bad injury, that's the one that sets you back, or if it's a whole bunch of little ones that add up, or some combination in the middle.
Okay, and then I'm going to sneak in another quick question.
Quick point to add to that, and it was in one of the researchers I did a podcast with talking about vision but in a performance sense. So it was kind of separate from the head injury discussion. It was that, and it's similar to people will compare lack of sleep to drinking and driving, that it impairs certain, whether it's your vision, reaction time, so maybe you're more apt to get in a car accident if you didn't sleep properly. What the study showed, that it wasn't the person I was interviewing wasn't the one that did the research. It was out of the States, and again, a research that was reliable, and I couldn't quote it right now, but it was interesting. They did a research with a football team, and they trained the football team for, I think it was 4 or 5 years with visual training, and it decreased the amount of concussions they were sustaining. So not to say, well, vision, improving your vision lower your chances or prevent concussion, but it's interesting if you sustain a concussion and it affects your vision and you're just half a second off, but you don't notice it consciously, or your body doesn't move as well as it used to because something's damaged or there's an issue that hasn't been dealt with, are you more susceptible to injury? Not because your brain is weaker, but because you're not as quick or as reactive as you once were. So it's interesting that that's an important point I share with athletes, because it kind of challenges their ego, right? Are you really as athletic, I will use that term, as athletic as you were before the concussion?
So one comment on the study. We have to be a little careful with that study, because it was a study on football teams. They did implement preseason vision training, which is great. But they compared 4 years prior to the training to 4 years after. But they had 2 coaches in the 4 years prior, and at the same time they put the vision training in, they changed their entire coaching staff. So it may be the vision training, and I'm a vision person, but it may be the vision training, but it may also be the coaching staff, the education, the whole approach to concussion management in the entire staff. And the coaching staff after the vision training was different than the coaching staff before. So we have to be a little careful. That's a great example where research is great, but we have to be careful. We understand, we look at the entire picture and understand both sides of it. The performance piece, though, is what I do in the other part of my job when I don't work with brain injury patients, is I work with athletes in sports performance and how vision relates to that. And one of the big things we talk about, and why we argue for vision screenings or getting some vision testing done, I work with some of the hockey teams at the universities and other sports teams preseason, is because even if we don't identify things that might be risk factors for concussion or don't have good baselines, we can often identify things where if you had some vision training, or maybe if you had a pair of glasses or contact lenses, we could buy you time. Right? There's a latency to doing visual effort and focusing and changing focus. And if we can eliminate that latency, or we can make you more efficient or more accurate through a vision exam, we can buy you time. And there's not many ways in sport we can buy you time. That's a pretty rare area to buy time, right? So getting those things tuned up ahead of time may not prevent the injury, but it gives you fighting chance, and you've got all the best resources you have to hand.
Just very quickly, hearing seems to be missing here in our panel. Sorry? Concussion and hearing. That's funny.
You're right. And in fact, more and more, I've just joined the quality standards from the government we're setting standards for concussion. And there was big discussion about where are we going to find, and I can't even say it very well, an otolaryngologist, the hearing person, because it is so important, and we have not paid enough attention to it. We know that very clearly now. I was fortunate enough to be in Liverpool this year, and they had an otolaryngologist, again, I can't say it properly, have to practice that one, who had amazing expertise in first evaluating hearing and all the hearing mechanisms and what goes wrong after the hits to the head. And I basically said, well, can we just bring you over to Canada, or can you train some more people in Canada? But it's been hard to find people, I think, to have that as part of the regular team. I don't know if other people's.
Yes, absolutely, and we certainly know that, you know, many of my athletes with concussion do have hearing symptoms, hyperacuity, ringing in the ear, certainly intolerance of the construction that went on around our clinic for a year as we were building. So certainly it's a gap in Canada.
I'm just going to add one moment or thought. I don't have no idea what that word is that you're trying to say either. But we've recently had audiologists from the community come in and do what we call clinical rounds. So there are definitely resources in the community. I'm not sure on that specialty, but I think you'd want to look for an audiologist that has an interest in concussion management or vestibular rehab, because that's a huge part of concussion management.
Your nose and throat, way easier.
Okay.
Hi, I am here representing a few different community organizations, and as the trickle-down effect coming from Sport Canada and followed with Rowan's Law, has there been any rules, laws, regulations that have to or will be trickling down to community organizations in terms of protocol, training, and I guess the second part to that is any of that established with the Coach Association of Canada? Have they embedded all of this within their training for coaches?
Yes.
What are they?
So CAC, Coaches Association of Canada,
Yeah.
is involved, and really Parachute is what's used by many organizations for training. It's online, it's free, and Parachute Canada has a lot of these training programs already.
But is it required?
It is
Mandatory?
required by Rowan's Law. So what each institution or sport organization will do is have to implement the Rowan's Law. So here at our university, we are ensuring that all our sport, not just our varsity sport, but our recreational sport, you know, people working out, that the trainers working with those teams, and the part-time volunteer coaches have training, because that's the new law. And we have to have education. We're involved in the education part as well as the monitoring part. That's part of Rowan's laws, that we have to keep track and monitor. And in fact, OHIP is going to change the billing codes so that they can monitor how many times people are being seen in the healthcare system for concussion. So they'll be monitoring the concussion code in the system. So this will trickle down, and CAC, Coaching Association of Canada, does have some guidelines through Parachute.
Okay.
I'd just like to make a comment that I'm afraid I don't think it's as simple and successful
I don't think it is.
as that.
Yeah, I don't think it is, because I represent and I've been in the sport organizations for a number of years, and I know Rowan's Law is fairly new, but I haven't heard any of this.
Right.
I've heard programs, but none of it's been required or mandatory.
Yeah. And we run an amateur sports strategy in Hamilton, and I have just been appalled. But the problem is, so many of the people running the amateur sports are volunteers. And when we spoke with the Ministry of Sport and Tourism about Rowan's Law, and yes, it's a law, and the enforcement probably will not be a big thing, because ultimately we want kids to participate and we want them to be in sport. And if we send away all the coaches and volunteers because we're making it so onerous, or we're punishing them for not doing training, so we have to approach it in a very creative way, I think.
Thank you. Sorry. Thanks. Hi. So this is my classmate Brenna and I. We're both in our masters here at Guelph, and we are in a class that we have to create a business and a product, and we've actually targeted concussion. And so we're hoping to create products, one kind of to take prior to concussions if you're more at risk, and one following concussions. And our main ingredient is omega-3, kind of the natural side of things. So we were just curious how you guys felt about kind of the prehabilitation rather than rehabilitation in thoughts of concussion, and if you would recommend that, or if there's ways to kind of improve the brain and body's ability to deal with concussion.
Well, I know you're at the right university for this work. Because here at the University of Guelph, and I think I probably know your professor.
Yeah, we're with Robinson. We're going to be doing some work with you, I think.
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
So in fact, we don't know, right? That's why you need to do the studies. Right, yeah. And that's why Lindsay is doing these studies, and we need to find out. So is there evidence that there's rehabilitation or prevention through nutrition that you can do? I certainly hope so, and I'm really looking for you to tell me the answer to that. So I think there's enough preliminary evidence to say it's worth looking at, which is why we're looking at it.
Definitely.
So
and
I'm really holding you to answer that question for all of us.
We hope so. Any thoughts on CBD oil as well for pain management and inflammation? You can say something else too.
Sorry, I was just going to add to that first question. I don't know anything about CBD. I'm sorry, but
no, it's okay.
So there's actually a recent study that was done that looked at prehabilitation, and they did preventative programs in footballers in England, youth footballers, and the cool thing about the study is usually you're looking at incidence rates of knee injuries, ACL, ankle, that sort of thing. But what they also did in terms of their injury surveillance was they looked at concussions. And what they found was that compared to the control group that didn't do the prehabilitation, they found a 3 times decrease in the amount of concussions in the prehabilitation group. So it's really cool kind of information. Another thing that has been kind of studied is what's the effect of concussions having on other parts of the body. So there was a study that was done, it was a biomechanical study, but there was a study that was done with looking at loading after concussion. And what they found was significant changes. So these are all university studies that are done. So they have copious amounts of data on their varsity athletes. But what they would do is they would look at what the loading was for biomechanical studies, and then these people that had concussions, they did the same tests afterwards, and they found a significant change in the loading through the hip, the ankle, the knee afterwards. So we start to think, what are the other effects of concussion as well? Is that setting our athletes up for further injury in other areas of the body, and therefore is that not reason to implement some preventative prehabilitation as well, because we know that those programs work for lower extremity stuff. So it's really cool that it can hopefully work for concussion as well. So we're looking to you guys to do that. I'll pass it on about the CBD oil.
No, that's okay.
I have an anecdotal story. I worked with a physician who ran one of the kind of medical marijuana CBD clinics in town. And I, of course, asked him the question about, have you tried it with people with concussion and chronic headache? And he said yes. And in fact, he did keep the data, and it was basically 50-50. It worked for some and it didn't work for others. And he didn't have any factors that were predictive of who it would work with. But I thought it was encouraging. At least some of them worked.
So I've heard and seen, like in research, that a lot of times, especially with athletes at like the high school or varsity level, that they will underreport their symptoms because they don't want to be benched or they want to go back. And is there anything kind of with the SCAT or anything like that to kind of compensate for that underreporting?
The SCAT, they have to have reported. So the SCAT will not help us with that. What will help us is raise awareness. So the concussion spotters that are mandatory at games at the elite level, and having trained, coaches, parents, and teammates that can say, "Hey, you're not acting normal," or that was a hit that should have really rung your bell. So that's the kind of thing that's going to pick up those underreporters. And we do know people underreport because they're invincible. It won't happen to them, and they want to go and play because that's normal, and we'll just pretend that didn't happen. But that's maybe what happened to Rowan, right? And that didn't end very well. So we really need to have that raised awareness in amongst teammates, coaches, parents, and athletes themselves, like the person who got hit themselves, to say, check it out. When in doubt, check it out.
I wanted to say something all night, and this, I think, is my segue into it. I think we have to change our whole approach to this, and certainly with the kids and the youth athletes. They think we're trying to keep them out of the sport, and so they're under-reporting because they want to get back there. And so we're reframing it, again, learning from working with our sports people. This will help you win, because your best athletes will be back on the team and at their best sooner. And so we're really just turning it around. And I had a young guy, he was 10, and he said, "I'm only at stage 2. I'm never going to make it to the hockey rink again. It's never going to work." So again, we've learned we just have to turn it around. We're doing this to get you back, not to keep you out. So that's helped a little bit with certainly some of the kids, I think. Ben.
Brett, you can go first.
Brad.
I think having a night like this sort of speaks to the change that's needed in some of the culture when we're talking about this with our youth athletes and our coaches and our teachers and that sort of thing. We're not hosting a broken leg symposium night. So when you think about it, I was talking to Ben about this. It's crazy that sometimes we have parents that think, well, my kid hit their head, they felt dizzy, they had a headache, but I thought it was going to go away, that sort of thing. I say to those parents, well, if your kid had fallen and sprained their ankle and it ballooned up to twice the size, would you not have gone to the doctor and seen about it and then managed it appropriately within that window of opportunity that you have? But because, and this is what Ben alluded to as well, because it's a hidden injury, you go with your teammates, and I think there's a stigma that you're not pulling your weight on the team as well. And people, I have my patients that say, like, do you have like concussion hats to sell? Like, I can wear a concussion hat so everyone knows I have a concussion, but because I look the same as everyone, but I'm not feeling the same as well. And so there's definitely a pressure within the team environment to pull your weight, be a team player, and push through. And we know that you can't do that with concussion. Unfortunately, that's one of the things that Rowan Stringer tried to do, and unfortunately to a tragic end as well. So having nights like this, having education sessions with our organizations, our doctors, WSIB organizations, that sort of thing, I think that will help to lead some sort of change. I can see it already. We're starting at the grassroots level, and it is starting to change. Part of that is what Dr. DiMatteo alluded to, is that we can't keep kids out of sport, and we can't make them fearful that concussion is going to end their season or anything like that as well. So we need to normalize it somehow, that it's it's an injury that you can recover from, I'm really confident that we can get the vast majority of our patients better from concussion. Does everyone recover from concussion 100%? No, that's not the case. Does everyone recover 100% from recurrent ankle sprains? No. So, but we need to make sure that there's not the stigma attached to concussion, and I think that's the change that we're starting to see, and I think hopefully that's what we need to implement to be able to stop kids from masking their symptoms and just going out and playing.
Can I add one thing? Just to add on that, and it's a really important thing, I think, that Brett alluded to it, is that we're all learning still. Even as medical practitioners in practice, we're all learning too. And so whether it be you're out here as a family member, as a concussion sufferer, as a medical practitioner, and learning, if you're in a clinic or you're going to see someone, or you're just not feeling right, and someone's going, nah, that's not right, you can take what you've learned tonight and share that with your doctor, share that with your medical team, and say, actually, there is evidence out here to say what I'm feeling is not me going crazy. I'm not telling, I am telling the truth. I feel this way, and this is real. And here, I can teach you something, right? I see it a lot in the vision clinic, because oftentimes, a lot of time, people come to get their vision checked. They've tried everything, and they're 2 or 3 years out, and there's nothing left. And they come to me, and they say, I've seen so many docs, and half of them have told me I'm crazy. And I'm going, you're not crazy. This is real. But if you can empower your friend, yourself, your family member, tell your doctor, share a story, share the consensus statement. We can all download it online, not just doctors. But if you can take that information with you, you can also help train somebody else, and they too can pass on that information.
On strictly the social side and in a competitive environment, the way I sat on this for a while because people would ask me to come and speak about concussion with young athletes. And my approach to it is I try to challenge the ego of the individual, because I was there when the doctor said, hey, you can play again, after the situation I went through. So I know exactly what it's like when that game is at whatever level. It doesn't matter if it's the OHL, if it's high school, if it's junior, whatever. I know what it's like to think it's everything and that you have to play. But what I remember and what I know for sure is that in the back of our minds, we're human, and there's that little bit of fear. There is that little bit of fear there. And how I approach it to young athletes is I try and challenge their egos. So I say, if you sustain a concussion and you feel the need to go back into the game, who's in control? Because athletes love to be in control. We love to be leaders. We love to be in charge. So if you've sustained a concussion and people are saying you probably shouldn't go back in, and you're thinking, I need to because I need to play, who's in control? Is sport in control, or are you in control of your actions? Or sport telling you, hey, you need to go back in and play because it's everything, and you're going to make millions of dollars, and you're going to be the guy or the girl and be the star. So I try and challenge the ego, and I've had some really good feedback with that from coaches as well, saying, yeah, our players actually tapped each other or tapped their teammate and said, right, like, are you sure you want to make this decision, kind of thing? And it was cool to hear that feedback. So if you needed an approach or something, it's not going to work every time, obviously, but that's the approach I take with that situation.
Just wondering, what is the current sort of method of filtering this kind of specialty information down to family doctors? Because I think as a volunteer coach, when a kid on one of my teams gets hurt, they go see their family doctor. They don't typically get taken by their parents to a specialty clinic. And often what we get is, oh yeah, no activity until all their symptoms goes away, or they're done for the season, 2 weeks into the season, which clearly, from what we're hearing, probably isn't always the case. I'm wondering where the level of education trickle down to most family doctors is right now.
Well, funny you should mention that, because we, through the Health and Performance Center here, hold a online education program for community physicians targeting family docs. And the first talk we gave this year was Brett and I on concussion guidelines. So a lot of what you heard tonight was for anyone who signed up, and we had over 80 participants that signed up in our local community to hear that talk on concussion. So that was targeted specifically at family physicians. There are other conferences and things that physicians can go to, but they are responsible to keep up their skills as in all areas of medicine, diabetes care, whatever. Concussion is one of them that we spent quite a bit of time talking about what the implications of Rowan's Law were for them and what the new guidelines were. And you could be part of that by taking what you've learned tonight back to your physicians.
I think you ask a very important question because even recently in the study that we've been recruiting kids from emergency, we would call them after being given their name by one of the healthcare physicians, call and say, we're recruiting you now for the concussion that your child had. And they said, oh no, our doctor told us he doesn't have a concussion. And the child clearly had a concussion. And we had a very recent one at a local hockey game, girls hockey. The girl got a terrible hit, definitely concussed, came off, and the paramedic said to her, oh no, you don't have a concussion, you can go back on. So I think we've come a long way, but I think those are the stories that just scare the life out of me. And I know, I would say 3/4 of our emerge docs at the Children's Hospital, for example, say the right thing, but we still have the outliers who don't. And we know that medical education is only just beginning to include concussion in the training. So I think spread the word.
And I gave a lecture 2 weeks ago to the family physician residents at McMaster University on concussion. So it is starting. Yeah. And you also?
Yeah. I teach the optometrists at Waterloo. We do, we've added concussion into their mandatory 4th-year program, and they spend now time, all of them spend time working with brain injury patients as part of their mandatory 4th-year training. So we're getting there, but it's gonna be a long road because there's lots of docs and lots of physicians and lots of people out there. But with every person we empower, you now have the power to share that message and take it out and empower more and spread the knowledge.
And I would just add one more thing to that. We're talking about education, but I still think we have a huge problem with attitude. And again, we have a study that proved that. If you call it a concussion, a number of people still do not take it seriously, and the outcome is often different than if you call it something like a mild traumatic brain injury. So, I mean, I think we should call it concussion now, but we have people who still believe it's just a bump on the head. So our work is still out there for us.
This is a good segue into my question, sort of tying that into Rowan's Law. You're put in this scenario as the trainer of a team where the parents didn't bother taking their child to see the family doctor. They saw a physiotherapist or some other allied health professional who said, oh, just sit out for 2 weeks and then you'll be fine because you're out of the window for getting a second impact syndrome. And so we're required as trainers to have the physician sign off on a form, but the family's refusing. So is that 2-week window legit? Recommendations for trainers in dealing with that kind of situation?
Well, I think, as we said, every child is an individual, and if those, the 2-week window comes from a physiological study that was published from rats in terms of brain healing, and in fact, it does not relate to every human being. So some kids might be safe, or some adults, but, well, adults don't get second impact syndrome, but that's why we really try to say don't use a recipe. And a 2-week window is a recipe. You have to evaluate the child and the person.
This question is for Ben. How many concussions do you believe you've sustained in your lifetime? And also, other than coaching, how are you still involved in sports? Like, are you doing beer league or anything like that?
I get recruited to beer leagues quite often, but I haven't, I've heard too many stories of guys getting injured in that, so I coach now. So that's my involvement, and then every once in a while I'll put my gear on with my players and play over at the University of Waterloo. So that's my involvement now, and then speaking with young teams about concussion and leadership and stuff like that is my involvement, and that's good enough. I don't miss the game as much as I miss the camaraderie and stuff, so good question. In regards to the concussion side of things, I would think for ones that are diagnosed, I think there might have been one when I was in minor hockey. And, you know, I would say I sustained it. They kept me off for what research was at that time, or what we were told is first it was go sleep, and then take well, I don't even really remember now, a certain amount of time off and then get back to playing, and knock on wood, I think I was okay. I was fine after that. And then obviously the injury I sustained wouldn't be considered a concussion. It was, you know, there were bleeds, and it was actually a subdural hematoma and 2 epidural hematomas, which is 2 bleeds on the surface and 1 inside. So that wasn't considered a concussion. So besides the one as a child or a youth, I'm not sure of none other that I've been, you know, aware of or that I've been told I had a concussion.
Clarify on that. So by definition, when he had bleeding in his brain and on top of his epidural, which is part of the covering on the brain, that isn't a concussion. That's a traumatic brain injury. Now, he would have symptoms similar to concussion symptoms in his recovery. So just by definition, that big hit was not a concussion.
I think just the situation right now is so powerful that here's an athlete that knows nothing about head injury and concussion. I'm trying to learn more, but I think that just that clarification there, then I can actually take that to someone else. And Christine Dalton correcting me, or just, you know, be a little more curious about that research though. That's my biggest message today, and I know we still have some more questions, but it's just, I can't hammer that home enough. I care so much about people that are going through this, and just drop your ego for a second and say, I don't know enough about it. Please, all of you, tell me and enlighten me and educate me so that I can then educate everyone else. So I think that I just needed to make a point of that situation because now it's clarified and it's important. So. Sorry.
I was stored on my bicycle September 1st, and I've really tried hard to find a way to get help. And my family doctor sent me to physio. He just said, go to physio. My physiotherapist did a wonderful job at going through the steps. I had my knee, it hit here near the femur here, and everything got pushed back and that sort of thing. And my neck was bad, and I couldn't open my jaw for 2 weeks. And the physiotherapist wrote everything down, suggested I should go to a neurologist, and the paperwork was sent to my doctor, and he didn't read it. And I've struggled trying to find something, and a PSW, the insurance company sent a PSW, or was going to send a PSW, and then they realized that I needed a medical nurse because I couldn't get it through anybody's head that I had a ring that would come in my ear maybe for about 4 or 5 seconds, and then it would go away, and a few days later it might be the other ear. But the real kicker was that I still have, and I got a bad headache right now, I still have a constant static in my head, and it drives me nuts. I can't sleep at night until hours go by before I can fall asleep. I don't want to take drugs, and I begged my doctor to get a CAT scan. That was clear. And I'm wondering, should I ask for an MRI? I don't know, but the medical nurse sent me to a vision therapy. I was shocked at what, you know, that I need help in that respect. But I looked up on the Mayo Clinic, and it said you can have a static or something, and that's what I have. And when I got to see an ENT finally this past week, and he said to me, you do have a hearing loss. And he says, you've got the tinnitus, or the ringing in your ears. I said, yeah, but that doesn't happen all the time. I said, it's this constant static thing that, you know, and the headaches when I lay in my back or I'm trying to concentrate. And it's just hard to deal with it because I look healthy, you know, and it's very frustrating. And I'm just I'm wondering, is an MRI, maybe that would help? Would that show anything? Do you think?
I'm still stuck on the part where you said your family doctor didn't read it.
I'm sorry?
Because I'm stuck on the part where you said your family doctor didn't read the report from the physio. Yeah, and that concerns me. I was a family doctor for 30 years, and I read everything that came in. So you can book an appointment and pull up the paper and say, let's read this together, and encourage your doctor to read it and respond. And you know, maybe it got lost, but by sitting down with them, that might help. But in response to your actual question, not the one I got stuck on, your actual question was about the MRI. And by definition, a concussion, the MRI will be normal. It's not a functional change, a structural change. It's how the brain functions, it's not how it's look. It would be like taking a snapshot of the factory saying, what a lovely picture. But what the snapshot doesn't show us is how it functions inside the factory. So in fact, there's something called a functional MRI. That might be very helpful, but that's not readily available for the public. It's something that we use in research, and that shows some significant promise in diagnosing concussion, because you can put someone in the machine, have them do some computations and brain activity, and you can see the changes in the function. Now, the structure won't look any different, so a plain MRI will not likely be helpful for you. Agree?
I think, unfortunately, that'll be our time limit today. I think for further questions, there'll be resources online, and I won't offer everyone up to the audience, but I think there'll be resources or connections, contact information for these individuals here that maybe you connect over email, or you go in and see them might be an option as well. In closing, and I know I touched on it briefly as Dr. Mountjoy there corrected what I was saying, or added a little more validity and guidance, whatever you want to call it, to what I was saying. As I look back on my story, and we have the privilege of having these experts here today, to be honest, I didn't have any experts specifically, other than the neurologist I saw that allowed me to go back to play. That's the one, you know, expert like this that I was lucky enough to see. And during my recovery, it was just conversations like this. As many conversations like this as I could have. It was putting myself in social settings that I was optimistic. And when I opened and said I didn't really experience the dark room, it wasn't because I didn't want to or didn't have the opportunity, it's because I didn't have the opportunity. I didn't have an opportunity to sit in my billet house, because I moved back with my billet family in Kitchener. I didn't have the opportunity to sit in my basement room and take weeks off and sit in the dark. I wasn't given the opportunity. I was involved myself in school, as long as, again, my symptoms weren't becoming any worse. I was in social settings I needed to be in, some more difficult than others, but it kept me and gave me hope. And so I had a toolbox full of tools. Maybe 2 of them worked out of 40 different tools that I had. I was in a positive setting. I was a sponge of everything about concussion, trying to take in all the information I could. And people say, what was it? Or did you have any special skills or knowledge beforehand that helped? And I didn't. I don't have any special skills today. And the reason I do these talks, and the reason I try to share what these experts know and get their voice out there even more, is because I was given this second chance, really. And I know that's so cliche, but it wasn't, I don't think it was luck. I think it was because people that didn't know who I was supported me. And it was just a pat on the back. I used to go to Tim Hortons right by the rink in Kitchener, and the baristas there would give me free coffee and say, hey, I heard what happened to you. I wish you the best. I don't know if you'll ever play sports again, but you know what, we're pulling for you. People that didn't know who I was. And it is so similar to mental health. And so this whole conversation, and hope's a big part of it. You know, if you stay in the dark room for a day, where will that lead you? If that same day you decide, because your buddy taps you or you provide hope to someone, and that person, instead of staying in that dark room, they get out of it for that day and they go for a walk or they go for that exercise, that may be the one day that allows them to then walk day 2, which allows them to run on day 3. And there are a lot of stories that show that. So in conclusion, I would say all the messages, if you take 3 things today, awesome. Not all the messages given today are going to help everyone here, but take 2 or 3 messages, share them with someone, because that may be the one thing they need to hear that gets them out of that dark room. So that day 2, like I said, is walking, day 3 is running, and hopefully they don't slide back down the ladder and they keep going and keep pushing. So don't run on day 3. Right. Did I even listen, right? But you get what I mean. So I thank everyone for being here, because really, not only are you empowering yourselves, I know at some point you're going to share the information you learned today and you're empowering someone else. So thank you very much for being here. And again, if there's any questions, we'll do our best to point you in the right direction with resources after. Thank you.